Module number 5, the ego. And this is one of my favorite topics to talk about because for you doctors and dentists, as healthcare professionals, we went to a ton of schooling to get the doctor in front of our name. And so we've been validated by our right answers. We've earned it. You've earned it. And many times, though, our ego gets in the way of our decision making. And what is the ego? If we break it down, our ego is just really our protective shield. And so for this module, some of your key takeaways is really exploring how the ego shows up in your life, shows up as a leader, how it has certain trigger points within your practice as a leader of your team, how it shows up with your patients, how your patient's ego affects you as the leader, how your team's ego affects you as the leader, and how ego can really cause much separation in some of the decision making. And I'm going to show you what tools you can use, another takeaway, so that you can practice this with your team. Lastly, one of the other things is knowing how to check in with your ego on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, so that you can make proper decisions as a result and realize that they're not based off of fear. And one last tidbit. When we're talking about our egos, we want to definitely make sure that we realize there are also positive aspects to having the ego, and there's a couple of different pointers in the course for this module that's going to help you navigate through that. But specifically around the ego, and what I want to share with you, think of times where in your practice life, within your patients, within the teams that you serve and the communities that you're serving, even in your own life, how has ego really strengthened where you are today as a leader? How has ego shaped your life? Because what we want to be able to do is understand how the ego plays a role in our lives. And really what the ego is it's just your protection, it's just your shield. And so if we think about it from a business perspective, out in the world, any time that we're challenged for whatever reason, we have our guard up. And our guard is really our ego. And when the guard is up, not only does it cause separation, but we make decisions then based off of pride, based off of fear, based off of scarcity. And the way that we lead sometimes the ego becomes a driver. And in my own life, I can share a few examples how this plays out of the chip on the shoulder. You see, when I was in practice, many times to prove my worth or to prove my wherewithal as a cosmetic dentist and really claiming the stake at this field, because I was governing with limiting beliefs that I wasn't good enough or I didn't have as many credentials or I wasn't old enough or all of these things that I had in my head. Now, it really placed my ego at the forefront. So I would overcompensate in various ways for my team, so that made me not lead as in an authentic way that I wanted to. It definitely caused a dissonance and if a separation and a disconnection between my patients, because I felt like I needed to be higher than everyone else. And in order to prove my worth and in order to prove that I had the credibility. And so if you can think about circumstances in your own life where the ego really has fueled you in a negative way, where you've made decisions based on some of these fears, fear of not being good enough, fear of being an imposter, fear of not being accepted, not belonging, for whatever reason, we have all of these instances, and that's part of just the human makeup. The ego is there to really protect you. And when the ego then becomes destructive is when we don't realize that, or when we don't understand the purpose of that. So I'm not trying to say that the ego is entirely wrong, but for you to be able to check in with your ego and see if the decisions that you're making are based out of fear. And in understanding yourself, you can understand where your patients are coming from. So for example, when you have a patient that's completely afraid, that's been burned by several different dentists, and comes to your office for a solution, and you build this connection with the patient, but for whatever reason, she's got these blocks, and she's got these blocks from really wanting to trust you. So her ego comes in, and being able to understand her perception and her perspective, because she's been burned by so many doctors, right? Or so many different situations. And it takes her a little bit longer to warm up to you. Now, she may base her actions as a result of some of the previous instances in her own life, but understanding where she's coming from will then allow you to put your ego or your guard down, so that when you come to her level, there's definitely that point of connection. Are you following? I hope this is making sense, because once you understand where some of these fears are coming from, then essentially as a healthcare professional, you can lower your ego and really come from a place of empathy and compassion. And so the key characteristics for this week is really when we drop our ego, we can really understand from a point of empathy and compassion and how to govern our lives with that. Whether it's in our personal lives, whether it's with our teams, and empowering them to cultivate a sense of compassion and empathy for our patients that we serve. And really understanding the basic fears and these fear patterns and the thought processes behind where your patients are coming from. And more so even having the compassion within your own life, so that you're giving yourself a break. We have to acknowledge that you're doing the best that you can being a leader. It's not easy being able to be in charge of 100,000 things in any given week. And in any point in the day, there's so many different tasks that you're in charge of. So yes, give yourself a hand that you're being able to do that. However, now, when we lead with empathy and compassion, we can realize and honor that our ego is there to show us what we need to learn in ourselves. And so, going back to some of the key takeaways for this week, if you can be empathetic with your teams and share how the ego has really affected you in a negative way. Perhaps you put someone in your team down for frustration, and because you were anxious or you were afraid of a patient coming back at you or threatening to sue you for whatever, or writing a bad review, that's when we become guarded. We tense up in our muscles, we tense up in our faces, and our ego then arises. Or when a patient failed to pay their bills or failed to agree upon a financial treatment plan, the ego comes up. But being able to understand where that patient is coming from really can soften the ego. So number one, being able to understand where the ego is coming from and how the fear can really cause a disruption in the way that your leadership is, meaning that how that fear can really jeopardize your decision making within your teams and as a healthcare professional. And lastly, how your ego can inhibit you from being that leader. And as doctors, yes, we've earned the right to have the credibility before our name, but what happens when we lead with more empathy and compassion?